The camera drifts slowly across a desolate Hungarian landscape, shrouded in thick, rolling fog. From the mist, a looming silhouette emerges, a castle perched high upon a lonely hill. Its stone walls, weathered by centuries of wind and war, rise like the bones of some ancient giant. This is Čachtice Castle, a fortress whose name still echoes with dread across Europe. For here, according to legend, lived one of the most terrifying figures in human history, Elizabeth Báthory. Known forever as the Blood Countess, she has been accused of crimes so grotesque they sound like the script of a Gothic horror tale. The story goes like this. Elizabeth lured young peasant girls into her castle under the promise of work, only for them to vanish into the shadows of her chambers. Witnesses swore they heard screams piercing the night, cries of girls being tortured, mutilated, and drained of their blood. It is said that Elizabeth would bathe in this blood, believing it held the secret to eternal youth and beauty. Over the centuries, her name has become synonymous with evil. She has been called the most prolific female serial killer in recorded history, accused of slaughtering more than 600 innocent victims. A woman of nobility transformed into a monster, a countess who feasted not on power alone, but on human life itself. But as chilling as this tale may sound, history often hides more than it reveals. When we peel back the layers of myth, the truth becomes far less certain. Was Elizabeth Báthory truly a sadistic predator, a noblewoman addicted to blood and cruelty? Or was she something else entirely, a victim herself, ensnared in a political conspiracy designed to strip her family of its immense wealth, land, and influence? Tonight, we step into the fog of the past, where myth and reality blur together. We will descend into the shadowy halls of Čachtice Castle, sift through centuries of whispers and accusations, and ask a haunting question. Was Elizabeth Báthory truly one of history's most bloodthirsty killers, or the casualty of a deadly power struggle?
The fog thickens around Čachtice Castle, curling like pale fingers across the hills. Locals in the villages below speak in hushed voices, even today, about the nights when their daughters vanished. A girl would leave her family's cottage with dreams of serving in the noble household, or simply to deliver goods to the castle kitchens. But she would never return. Mothers wept, fathers searched the roads, but the trail always ended at the looming black gates of Čachtice. Rumors spread like wildfire. It was whispered that inside those stone walls a nightmare was unfolding, an unspeakable cruelty dressed in silks and jewels. The noblewoman of the house, Countess Elizabeth Báthory, was said to have transformed her castle into a prison of torment. Witnesses claimed that her chambers echoed with screams, muffled by thick curtains but impossible to ignore. By candlelight, Elizabeth's pale figure would stalk the corridors, accompanied by her loyal servants, who carried chains, iron rods, and cruel instruments designed not for labor, but for pain. The tales grew darker with each retelling. Girls were beaten until their bones cracked, their flesh branded with fire-heated irons. Some were stabbed with needles, others cut with blades, their blood gathered in bowls. Servants later testified that Elizabeth delighted in cruelty, biting her victims' flesh, tearing away pieces with her teeth, and laughing as they writhed in agony. And then came the most chilling accusation of all, that Elizabeth did not torture for discipline or out of madness alone. She tortured for beauty. According to the legend, one fateful evening, Elizabeth struck a young maid across the face for a minor mistake. Blood splattered across her hand, and as she wiped it away, she believed her skin looked smoother, younger, more radiant. From that moment, a terrible obsession took root. If a single drop of blood could restore her beauty, What would an entire bath accomplish? Thus the myth was born. Elizabeth Báthory, the Blood Countess, who bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. The villagers claimed her bathtubs were filled with crimson. Her alabaster skin glistened red as candlelight flickered against stone walls, turning the chamber into something between a torture room and a grotesque spa of immortality. In the dark corridors, servants swore they saw Elizabeth herself, draped in gowns soaked to the hem with blood, her eyes glinting like a predator's. To them she was no longer a noblewoman, but a vampire made flesh, a living embodiment of evil. One haggard servant girl, forced to participate in the horrors, later confessed to the authorities. "I held the basin as my mistress laughed. The girl's blood flowed, and my lady rubbed it across her skin as if it were perfume." Another claimed, "She said their screams were music, and their blood her fountain of youth." Imagine the atmosphere of that castle in the 1600s. The long stone halls lit only with wavering candlelight, shadows crawling across cracked walls. The air reeked of iron and smoke. Outside, the wind howled across the Carpathians, but inside the sound was worse. The echo of boots dragging prisoners down to the cellars, the crackle of fire as irons heated, and above all the piercing cries of young girls rising, breaking, then vanishing into silence. The peasants dared not climb the hill, for they said demons themselves guarded the gates. But they told each other stories, each darker than the last. They described Elizabeth standing tall and proud in her courtyard, her lips red not from wine, but from blood. They called her the she-wolf of the Carpathians, and in time she was feared as much as Vlad the Impaler himself. Her reputation became monstrous, almost supernatural. Some claimed she could not die, that her baths in blood had turned her into an immortal being. Others said she was a witch who had sold her soul, trading compassion for eternal youth. And in every whispered tale her victims multiplied, 12, 100, 600. By the height of the legend, Elizabeth Báthory was no longer merely a cruel noblewoman. She was a living nightmare, a vampire cloaked in human form, a countess whose hunger for blood rivaled that of any monster in folklore. The villagers, clutching their rosaries, asked one another the same question. Was she even human anymore? Or had their countess, once admired for her wealth and beauty, crossed into the realm of the damned? And so the legend of the Blood Countess was sealed. A story of disappearing girls, of chambers awash in crimson, of screams rising into the night, carried by the wind across Hungary. A story that would outlive Elizabeth herself, growing darker with each century, until her name became synonymous with horror. Whether true or false, the image burned into history is unforgettable. Elizabeth Báthory, pale and regal, standing in her castle of shadows, bathing in the blood of innocence, and smiling as if she had conquered time itself.
If the legend paints Elizabeth Báthory as a vampire queen, then the records of history attempt to strip away the shadows. But do they succeed? In 1610, after years of growing whispers, King Matthias II of Hungary ordered an investigation into the Countess. What followed was one of the largest legal inquiries of the early modern era. Nearly 300 witnesses were questioned: nobles, priests, villagers, and Elizabeth's own servants. The testimony filled volumes, and on the surface, the evidence looked overwhelming. Witness after witness described seeing bruised bodies, hearing screams, or watching girls disappear into Čachtice Castle. Some testified they carried corpses out in the dead of night, others that they saw Elizabeth beat her servants to death with her own jeweled hands. The stories matched the legends: blood, cruelty, a lust for youth. But here is the critical detail. When historians examined those records centuries later, a strange pattern emerged. Most of the testimonies were hearsay, rumors, second-hand accounts, tales retold around firesides. Few claimed to have seen the Countess kill with their own eyes. Many said only, "I heard from another servant," or "It was told to me that—" And when we search for hard physical evidence, something even stranger appears. It's missing. According to the myth, Elizabeth murdered as many as 600 girls. 600. If true, her castle should have been overflowing with corpses, the earth around it a graveyard of secrets. Yet no such mass burial sites have ever been uncovered. Archaeologists have scoured the grounds, and while some bones have been found, as one would expect in a castle centuries old, there is no clear proof of hundreds of victims. Where are the blood-soaked chambers, the iron torture devices, the infamous bathtub filled with crimson? None were ever presented in court. None survive today. The castle's ruins reveal cold stone, not dungeons carved with horrors. The so-called blood room exists only in the imagination of legend. So this forces us to ask, did Elizabeth truly slaughter hundreds of young women, or was the number exaggerated beyond belief? Consider this: 600 murders in less than 2 decades would mean nearly one victim every 2 weeks. In a sparsely populated region of 17th-century Hungary, the disappearance of so many daughters would have devastated entire villages, and yet the official records list far fewer missing persons. Forensic science sharpens the question further. If hundreds of bodies had been disposed of near the castle, we would expect to find mass graves, concentrations of remains bearing marks of torture. Yet, after 4 centuries, no convincing evidence of such a scale has been produced. The absence does not prove innocence, but it gnaws at the certainty of guilt. Then there is the matter of the trial itself. Elizabeth Báthory, noblewoman of one of Hungary's most powerful families, was never brought into court. She was never given the chance to speak in her defense. Instead, her servants were tortured to confession. Some admitted to burying bodies. Others described grisly acts in lurid detail. But we must remember, in the 1600s, under the agony of the rack or the flame, people confessed to anything. They confessed to witchcraft, to consorting with the devil, to crimes they never committed simply to end the pain. So how reliable are these confessions? And why was the Countess herself silenced? The historian Laszlo Nagy once observed that Elizabeth Báthory's trial was less about murder and more about power. The Báthory family controlled vast lands and wealth. King Matthias owed Elizabeth a large sum of money, a debt he had little interest in repaying. By accusing her of monstrous crimes, by painting her as a demon in human skin, the crown could strip her of property and seize her estates. Convenient, isn't it? Suddenly, the story of the Blood Countess looks different. Not just a tale of horror, but also a tale of politics. Perhaps Elizabeth was cruel to her servants, as many nobles were in that brutal age. Perhaps she even caused deaths by negligence or rage. But was she truly the greatest female serial killer of all time? Or was her reputation inflated, twisted, and weaponized until it became a myth larger than life? The absence of corpses, the hearsay testimonies, the suspicious silence of the accused herself, all of it leaves a shadow of doubt. What we are left with is not certainty, but a puzzle. And this puzzle forces us to confront an uncomfortable possibility. What if Elizabeth Báthory's true crime was not bathing in blood, but being a powerful woman in a world that feared powerful women?
To understand the fate of Elizabeth Báthory, we must leave behind the flickering torches of legend and step into the calculating chambers of politics. Because in 17th century Hungary, blood was not only spilled on stone floors, it was spilled in courtrooms, in treaties, and in whispered alliances. The Báthory family was no ordinary noble house. For centuries, they had been one of the most powerful dynasties in Hungary and Transylvania. Their members sat on thrones, commanded armies, and held vast tracts of land. The name Báthory carried both prestige and fear. It was the kind of family that kings either married into or sought to destroy. Elizabeth herself was born into this world of privilege, and when she married Ferenc Nadasdy, a famed warrior known as the Black Knight of Hungary, their union became a fortress of power. Together, the Báthory holdings stretched across wide territories, estates so rich and fertile that they rivaled the influence of the crown itself. But power attracts enemies, and in Elizabeth's time, no enemy was more formidable than the House of Habsburg. The Habsburg dynasty was tightening its grip on Central Europe, seeking to centralize authority in Vienna and reduce the independence of the Hungarian nobility. For families like the Báthorys, this was a direct threat. They stood as a wall against Habsburg domination, a reminder that Hungary's great lords would not easily bow to foreign rule. Then, fate struck. In 1604, Ferenc Nadezhdy died, leaving Elizabeth a widow. Suddenly, she controlled one of the greatest fortunes in Hungary. Castles, lands, and thousands of serfs, all under her authority. For a woman in that era, such wealth was both a crown and a curse. It made her independent, powerful, and vulnerable. Here is where the story darkens. Because while the legends of Elizabeth bathing in virgin's blood grew more grotesque with each retelling, the political reality was simpler and perhaps far more sinister. Elizabeth was wealthy, the king was in debt to her, and the Habsburg court had everything to gain by erasing her. King Matthias II, in fact, owed Elizabeth an enormous sum of money borrowed during wartime. To repay it would weaken the treasury, but to accuse her of unspeakable crimes, that would not only cancel the debt, but also justify confiscating her estates, a perfect solution if one were ruthless enough. And so a narrative was crafted. Elizabeth was no longer a noble widow. She was transformed into a monster. Every cruelty she might have shown to her servants, every unexplained death, was twisted into proof of a bloodthirsty obsession. Servants were tortured until they spoke the words inquisitors wanted to hear. Witnesses repeated tales they had heard in taverns or whispered in kitchens. The truth was shaped, sharpened, and then unleashed upon the public. Some historians argue that the blood in Elizabeth's story was never literal. Instead, it was symbolic, a way to paint her as so vile, so corrupted, that stripping her of land and power became not only legal, but moral. By making her into a demon, the crown disguised theft as justice. Consider how useful the imagery was. To call her greedy or ambitious would not sway the people, but to call her a vampire who devoured the youth of peasant girls, that would stir horror, disgust, and a desire for vengeance. The legend served as a kind of political theater, ensuring that Elizabeth's downfall would be cheered rather than questioned. We also cannot ignore the role of gender in this conspiracy. In a patriarchal world, a widowed woman with immense wealth and autonomy was a dangerous anomaly. A man in Elizabeth's position might have been respected as a powerful lord, but a woman? She was more easily painted as a witch, a seductress, or a monster. To the Habsburgs, Elizabeth's gender was not just a detail, it was a weapon they could turn against her. And thus, the so-called Blood Countess may have been less a serial killer and more a victim of history's coldest strategy, character assassination. Think about it. By the time Elizabeth was accused, the Habsburgs had already begun consolidating power. To bring down a Báthory was to send a message to all nobles: resist and you will be destroyed, not only in life, but in legacy. You will not be remembered as a lord or lady, but as a villain, cursed forever in memory. And indeed, that is what happened.
Elizabeth was walled up in her own castle, condemned without trial, left to die in silence. Her fortune was dismantled, her family's power broken, and her name etched forever in infamy. Was she cruel? Almost certainly. Was she guilty of murder? Perhaps. But was she the monstrous figure of legend who slaughtered 600 maidens, or was that number a weapon, inflated to justify a political execution? The more we look at the historical context, the more the latter seems likely. Elizabeth Báthory may not have bathed in blood, but she drowned in politics. And so the blood of her story may not belong to innocent girls at all. It may belong to the dynasty she represented, spilled on the altar of Habsburg power.
At this point in the story, we are caught in a web of shadows. The flickering horror of blood-soaked chambers and the gray corridors of political intrigue. But where does truth end and legend begin? Let us consider a sobering possibility. Elizabeth Báthory may not have been the vampire countess of folklore, but that does not mean she was innocent. As a member of the nobility in 16th and 17th century Hungary, she wielded absolute power over her household and serfs. In that era, the lives of servants were cheap in the eyes of their masters. Punishments were often brutal, beatings, starvation, or worse, for even the smallest mistakes. For a woman of Elizabeth's rank, acts of cruelty might not have seemed monstrous, but merely disciplinary. And here lies one theory. Elizabeth was cruel, yes, but within the accepted, if barbaric, bounds of aristocratic discipline. Her abuses may have been real, but not unique. What set her apart was not necessarily her brutality, but the way those rumors were amplified, exaggerated, and ultimately weaponized. Take, for instance, the infamous number, 600 victims. To kill 600 young women in a sparsely populated region would have left a crater of grief, a silence impossible to hide. Whole villages would have mourned, parents would have demanded answers. And yet, aside from testimonies extracted under duress, the records remain strangely thin. The figure of 600 feels less like documentation and more like theater, a grotesque inflation designed to shock. This pattern, of course, is not unique to Elizabeth. Across Europe, during the fevered centuries of witch hunts, powerful or inconvenient women were often demonized. Wealthy widows who controlled land, midwives with medical knowledge, or simply outspoken women, all could be branded as witches, their property seized, their reputations destroyed, their bodies burned. Elizabeth's story fits eerily well into this tradition. She was rich, she was independent, and she stood in the way of royal ambition. And so she became a monster. Think of the imagery. Witches accused of flying on broomsticks, of sucking the life from infants, of dancing with the devil. None of it provable, but all of it effective. In Elizabeth's case, instead of a coven and a cauldron, the accusation took on the shape of a medieval nightmare, a noblewoman bathing in blood, feasting on youth. The symbols differ, but the strategy is the same. Turn a woman's power into society's terror. This blending of horror and politics is not limited to Hungary. History offers many similar tales. Consider Empress Wuzi X of China, remembered in some chronicles as a ruthless poisoner who murdered her own kin to seize the throne. Was she truly the monster described, or a victim of Confucian historians who despised a woman ruling in her own right? Or take the Roman Empress Messalina, depicted by later writers as a nymphomaniac deviant, her lust portrayed as a political corruption. In both cases, as with Elizabeth, the line between genuine cruelty and political slander blurs until only legend remains. This duality gives Elizabeth's tale its enduring chill. On one hand, there is the horror movie imagery,
The castle at night, the candlelight flickering over blood-stained stones, the cries of girls echoing through the halls. This is the first kind of fear, the visceral, grotesque fear of gore and sadism. But then comes the second fear, colder, sharper, and perhaps even more unsettling, the fear of manipulation. The realization that power can distort truth so completely that a woman can be turned into a monster not by her own hands, but by the pens of her enemies. That the true cruelty may not have been the tortures in Čachtice Castle, but the ruthless erasure of a human being by political necessity. It is this double horror that keeps us unsettled. Was Elizabeth Báthory a predator or prey? Did she drink the blood of virgins, or was her bloodline itself sacrificed to the ambitions of kings? Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. What we know for certain is that the legend was too useful to die. And so Elizabeth remains caught between history and myth. A woman who may have committed acts of cruelty, but whose image was stretched and twisted until it became something more than human. A vampire, a demon, a cautionary tale. She is a mirror reflecting both the brutality of individuals and the brutality of systems, where truth is drowned in blood or in ink. And this is why her story still haunts us, because whether she was a murderer or a martyr, the outcome was the same. Elizabeth Báthory was destroyed, her legacy drenched in shadows, and we are left not with answers, but with questions. Questions that chill us twice, once with the thought of blood on cold stone floors, and once with the realization of how easily truth itself can be murdered.
When the castle walls of Čachtice crumbled into ruin and Elizabeth Báthory's body was sealed away in an unmarked grave, it might have seemed like her story would fade into dust. But in truth, her death was only the beginning. For in the centuries that followed, Elizabeth would escape the confines of history and rise again, not as a noblewoman, not even as a criminal, but as a legend. And what a legend it became. Almost immediately, folk tales spread of the Blood Countess who bathed in virgin's blood to preserve her beauty. The story carried all the qualities of Gothic folklore: cruelty, vanity, forbidden ritual, and, above all, the transgression of a woman stepping outside her assigned place. Over time, these whispers grew louder, weaving Elizabeth into the same tapestry as werewolves, witches, and vampires. It is no coincidence that Elizabeth's legend merged with vampire lore. In 1897, Bram Stoker published Dracula, inspired partly by the historical figure of Vlad the Impaler. Yet many scholars note that Elizabeth too lurks in the DNA of the vampire mythos, the aristocrat feeding on the innocent, seducing and destroying youth to prolong her life. She was not fanged, but she was thirsty for blood, or so the stories claimed, and in the imagination of Europe, that was enough. By the 20th century, her myth had fully crystallized. In pulp novels and horror magazines, Elizabeth appeared as a literal vampire countess, draped in crimson gowns, surrounded by terrified maidens. Movies soon followed. Hammer Horror's Countess Dracula, 1971, portrayed her as a decadent noblewoman luring girls to their deaths. The Japanese exploitation film Báthory, Countess of Blood, pushed the imagery even further, reveling in sadism and sexuality. Each retelling blurred the line between history and nightmare until they became indistinguishable. And then came video games. In the world of Castlevania, Elizabeth Báthory appears as a vampiric villainess, cementing her as a staple of Gothic fantasy. She haunts RPGs, horror franchises, and dark anime, often serving as the archetype of the beautiful monster, a woman whose allure is inseparable from her cruelty. Even in American Horror Story, Hotel, Lady Gaga's character, the vampiric Countess, draws heavily from the myth of Elizabeth. The blood, the beauty, the cold indifference, it is all there, resurrected for a modern audience hungry for horror. But Elizabeth's ghost is not confined to fiction. She has also become a symbol, an archetype that the West cannot seem to shake. To some, she represents vanity taken to monstrous extremes, the obsession with youth and beauty consuming not only oneself, but everyone around. In an age obsessed with eternal youth, the image of a woman literally bathing in blood feels uncomfortably close to modern anxieties about plastic surgery, cosmetics, and the commodification of beauty. Elizabeth is the nightmare mirror of a culture that both worships and punishes female beauty. To others, she stands as the embodiment of aristocratic cruelty, the noblesse oblige turned inside out, the noble who should protect instead preys upon her subjects. In this way, Elizabeth becomes less an individual and more a symbol of class oppression, of wealth feeding on the poor. And yet in scholarly circles, her legacy is far less certain. Historians continue to debate whether Elizabeth was truly guilty of mass murder or whether she was a casualty of dynastic politics. The evidence, as we have seen, is fragmentary, circumstantial, and often contradictory. Was she a sadist who reveled in torture, or merely a wealthy widow whom her enemies needed to destroy? Was she a murderer, or merely murdered by reputation?
This tension is precisely what gives her story its enduring power. She is not merely a monster, nor merely a victim. She is both and neither, a liminal figure caught forever in ambiguity. That ambiguity allows every generation to project onto her what it fears most. For the romantics of the 19th century, she was the vampire countess, seducing and devouring beauty itself. For the social critics of the 20th century, she became the decadent aristocrat, proof of the corruption of the ruling class. And for the postmodern world, she is a symbol of how power manipulates narrative, turning people into myths and myths into tools. In this sense, Elizabeth Báthory is less a woman than a canvas. On her, culture has painted vanity, cruelty, lust, ambition, and the darkest corners of human imagination. But the real Elizabeth, the flesh and blood countess, remains hidden, buried not just in an unmarked grave, but beneath centuries of fear and fascination. And perhaps that is the ultimate legacy. For in the end, what terrifies us about Elizabeth is not merely the blood, nor the torture, nor even the whispers of vampirism. It is the reminder that history itself can be weaponized, that a person can be transformed into a monster by rumor, by politics, by narrative, that truth can be drowned in legend, just as surely as a girl's scream can be drowned in the stone halls of a castle. Elizabeth Báthory endures because she is a riddle with no answer. Was she a sadistic killer, a tragic victim, or something in between? The truth is lost to time, but the myth remains, sharper and darker than ever. And so in castles and stories, in books and screens, she still lives. The vampire countess, the blood bather, the widow turned monster. Whether real or imagined, her shadow stretches across centuries. And as long as humanity hungers for stories of beauty and horror, cruelty and power, Elizabeth Báthory will rise again, forever trapped between woman and myth, history and nightmare. Because monsters may die, but legends never do.
Today, if you travel to Slovakia, to the green hills surrounding the town of Trenčín, you will find the ruins of an ancient fortress, Čachtice Castle. Its gray stone walls, weathered by centuries of wind and rain, stand as silent witnesses to the past. Visitors do not come here only for the view. They come searching for a ghost, the ghost of a woman named Elizabeth Báthory. In the crumbling corridors, some say you can still hear whispers, a sharp, chilling laugh, or the faint echo of delicate footsteps in the night.
Is it mere imagination or the presence of a spirit never set free? No one knows for certain, yet everyone shivers when standing before the cold walls, walls that once heard accusations, judgments, and the hushed beginnings of legend. And there, one question still lingers in the air. Are we looking at historical truth or only the ghost of politics? More than 4 centuries have passed, and Elizabeth Báthory still cannot be defined by a single truth. Perhaps she was cruel. Perhaps she punished her maids with the brutality typical of the nobility of her age. But 600 missing girls? There is no proof. Mass graves? None have been found. Torture chambers soaked in blood? No trace. So if there are no bodies, no blood, no evidence, what remains? Only stories. Stories told by hundreds of witnesses, yet most of them second-hand. I heard it said. And we know that in history, stories can be bent, reshaped, and dyed in the colors of power. So perhaps the throne was not stained with the blood of 600 girls, but with the honor of a powerful woman who was torn down. That question has never been answered, but perhaps that is why Elizabeth Báthory continues to haunt us, because she is not just a figure of history, she is a mirror held up to human nature. If she truly was a murderer, then she stands as proof of how terrifying power can be when wielded by a ruthless hand. If she was merely the victim of a political plot, then she proves how terrifying power can be when it creates monsters out of people. Either way, the conclusion is the same. Power has stained itself with blood. Real blood or the blood of honor, we may never know the difference. And perhaps it is that very uncertainty that keeps the story of Elizabeth Báthory alive in our collective memory. For humanity is always haunted by 2 parallel fears: the fear that true evil exists and the fear that truth itself can be twisted into evil. Today, as you stand among the ruins of Čachtice Castle, you may see tourists lifting their cameras or film crews recreating gory legends. But pause for a moment. Breathe in the damp, chilling air that seeps from the stone. You may sense something more frightening than any horror movie: the feeling that history itself can be rewritten by the hands of the powerful. Elizabeth Báthory, murderer or victim, monster or shadow created to devour her honor? No one can say for certain, and perhaps no one truly wishes to, for sometimes humanity needs legends to reflect itself, needs monsters to feel less monstrous. And so perhaps Elizabeth Báthory will never be absolved. She will remain forever on the pages of books, in films, in video games, in collective memory, both the blood countess and the victim of a throne. And when night falls and the castle sinks into darkness, you may find yourself wondering, did Elizabeth Báthory truly stain the throne with blood, or did the throne itself bleed her name dry? The answer is left to history, or to the ghost still wandering those cold, empty halls. If you found this story both chilling and haunting, I want to hear from you. In your eyes, who was Elizabeth Báthory? Was she truly the blood countess who bathed in cruelty, or was she a victim of a ruthless conspiracy? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'll be reading them, and I'm curious to see where you stand on this dark legend. And if this tale kept you on edge, don't forget to subscribe to Dark Chronicles. This is only one of many twisted mysteries history has left us. On this channel, we dive into the shadows of the past, where power, blood, and betrayal collide. From forgotten rulers to infamous killers, from ghostly ruins to conspiracies that shaped kingdoms, there are countless secrets waiting to be unearthed. So hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and join me as we journey deeper into the night. Because the further we go, the more we realize history is never as clear as it seems. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for daring to step into the darkness with me tonight. Remember, history is not written only in ink, but in blood and in shadow.